Hey guys, and welcome back to a new video. In this video I will show you basically a full guide on how you can manage permissions in Jetpack Compose. And maybe you already saw my earlier video about permission handling in Compose. The reason I made this new one is that the old one is a little bit outdated. So the old video still used the components library, which was kind of a helper library for Jetpack Compose, but this library gets more and more out of date kind of. So I will make this new video and show you my approach to permission handling just using the normal framework functions. And this will really not only be that I show you, hey, this is how you make a permission request or so. No, I will show you my whole approach to managing permissions. And that includes showing a permission rationale, leading the user to the app settings screen if they permanently decline the permission. And as you can already see on my screen, requesting a single permission, what happens if you want to request multiple permissions at once, what happens if you want to show multiple request permission rationales at once. So I will show you a scalable approach in this video that you can reuse in all of your projects. So to just quickly show you what we will build, if we click on request one permission, then yeah, I just request the not the camera permission it's called, which is just a single one here. And let's say we decline this, then we will see permission required. Okay, we see a dialog that the camera permission is required, so that others can see in a call or whatever you use this permission for. If we then click OK, it will request the permission again. But as you maybe know in Android, if the user declined a permission twice, then this permission dialog won't show up again. So in that case, the only place where the user could still grant the permission to our app is in the app settings. So they would need to do that manually. So what we could do in that case, so if we decline this again, we will see another dialog. Permission required, it seems you permanently declined camera permission. You can go to the app settings to grant it. And if we now click grant permission, our app will send us to the app settings. And here we can then click on permissions and actually say, okay, the camera permission allow only while using the app. And that way we can then still grant our permission. So that's really the only thing we can still do, to send the user to the app settings and telling them, hey, please enable it back. And the same, of course, works if we want to request multiple permissions at once. So very commonly, for example, record audio and camera permission together for a video call. In my case, it's just random permissions. This is record audio and phone calling permission. Let's say we grant record audio and say while using the app, then it comes to phone calling. Let's say we don't allow that. Then we will again see our dialog, which this time refers to phone calling. So to be able to call your friends, please grant permission to this app, clicking OK. If we then hit allow, then it will be just fine. And if we click don't allow, then yeah, we again get this dialog that we permanently declined phone call permission, and we can click grant permission to enable it back in the app settings right here. So allow, and if all these are showing allow, then these buttons won't do anything anymore, since we then have these permissions. And I will just show you an approach that really scales. So even if you want to request 4 permissions at once, how you can show all these different dialogues with a minimum amount of code. And for that, let's dive into an empty Jetpack Compose project, where we just want to start adding our view model dependency in our Gradle build.gradle app file, scrolling down and adding this line here. Feel free to write that off or copy it from my GitHub repository down below. This is just so that we can get a view model reference in Jetpack Compose. Let's close this again and then start to implement our view model, which will be very simple in this case. Let's call it main view model, create a class, make that a view model, of course. And well, what will we have in here? What kind of states? In this case, because we want to show different dialogues one after another, because the user could potentially decline all these permissions that we request at once, we kind of need to queue in these dialogues. And what would better for a queue than a queue data structure? So let's implement that queue. I will do that as a normal state list of Compose. So it's not a real queue data structure, but we'll kind of simulate it. And let's call that val visible permission dialog queue. And that is a mutable state list of strings. So here we just pass the permission strings. Of course, this way you will bind your view model to Android dependencies, which permissions are. So this won't be locally unit testable. If you want to avoid that, it's a bit more work and a bit more code, but you can still do that. Then you would need to kind of have your own enum for every single permission you request and then pass that instead. But for the sake of simplicity, let's just keep it like this, and it will be fine if you don't plan to locally unit test this view model. What we then need is a function to actually dismiss a dialog. So when we either click on OK or outside of the dialog. What we then want to do is then we basically just want to pop the last entry of our queue. So the way a queue works is, well, so the first entry that gets in the queue is also the first entry that leaves the queue. That is what we call FIFO, so first in, first out. So let's say this would be our queue here, and we would, for example, first request our, let's say, camera permission. Then we would simply add that to our queue, of course. If we would then request record audio permission, for example, then we would insert that at the start of our queue. So record audio like this. And if we then show the dialog, then we will first of all show the dialog of the entry that got added in here first. If we then dismiss that camera dialog, what we'll do is we will remove that entry, so the last entry from our list, so that the next dialog that gets shown is our record audio one. So in the end, we just want to say we have a visible permission dialog queue and we remove we just want to remove the last entry, which will be the entry that got added in this queue first. And we also want to have a function on permission result, which we call when we get permission results. That takes in the permission we got the result for and whether that was granted or not. And if that was not granted, we want to add that to our queue at the first index. So visible permissions dialog queue add at the index of 0. I want to add our permission. And that will then queue in our permission dialog at the given position. Let's now go to main activity, or actually first the manifest to add our permissions here, or declare them. Uses permission, record audio, duplicate that twice. We want to have it for camera permission and phone calling, so call phone permission. If you have that, it seems like we also need to synchronize Gradle here. If you have that, we want to go to main activity, declare our view model, this green one, and we just say that's our main view model. We then have our dialog queue, which is simply view model visible permission dialog queue. So let's start with requesting one permission only, because that's of course easier. How does that work? We first of all want to build our little UI with our two buttons, which we'll put in a column. We say we have a modifier of modifier fill max size. We say the vertical arrangement is center and the horizontal alignment as well, so center horizontally. And in here, we will then have a button like this. Let's remove the on-click listener, actually the content. Let's keep it. Let's just have a text here for that button that says request one permission. We can then copy this button and put it below a spacer here. So we just have a little bit of spacing of 16 dp here in our layout, in our column, and then put our button down below, which will be for multiple permissions. So when we now click this top button to request one permission, we of course want to do exactly that. How can we now do one permission request in Jetpack Compose? For that, what we'll use is a so-called activity result launcher. So we will launch another activity to get a certain result. In this case, the other activity would kind of be the permission dialog you can think of. And to declare these result launchers, we can go up here and say we have a camera permission result launcher. And that's equal to, remember, a launcher for activity result. And here we need to define a contract. So the contract basically defines which activity gets launched for what kind of result. So we basically just have a contract between our activity and the activity that gets launched, and then we get a result out of that. And the contract we can define with activity result contracts, which is just a collection of these common contracts like capture video to get a video, or we use request permission. You can see there's also request multiple permissions, but let's start with request one permission. Declare that in here, and then in onResult, that gets called when the user actually selected the corresponding permission, or rather granted it or declined it. So here we get whether that was granted or not, and we can say view model on permission result. The permission we requested was camera in this case, so manifest permission camera, and is granted is just is granted what we get in here. And right now we only declared this launcher. We of course also need to launch it to fire off the permission request, which we can then do in our on-click listener right here. So camera permission result launcher that launch, and the input will be our permission that we want to request. So manifest permission camera. And if we now launch this app here on our device, we should already be able to accept or decline camera permission, but we are not able yet to actually see the permission rationale that explains to the user why that permission is needed and asks them to accept it again. So if we now click request one permission, we will see our permission dialog. And whatever we now click, it will stay at showing that dialog just once. So let's just dismiss this here by clicking outside and see how we can now implement our mechanism to show our different rationale dialogues. And for that, I will go to our root package and create a new composable, which we'll call permission dialog. Select file here, make that a composable function, call it permission dialog, and this will require some parameters. On the one hand, the permission we want to show the dialog for, so that will just be responsible for deciding which text we actually show in that dialog. We then want a boolean is permanently declined, which is a boolean. We want to have a listener for dismissing this. So on dismiss, when the user clicks OK, actually not OK, if the user clicks outside of the dialog, to simply hide it. We want a listener to, when the user clicks on OK, to request the permission again on OK click. And we want a listener that is for on app or on go to app settings click. So when the user declined the permission twice, and we now want to send them to the app settings to grant it again. And then we have a final modifier that we can pass to the root of our dialog. The way this will work is we will use an alert dialog composable. On dismiss request is just our dismiss function. Let's put this on separate lines, remove the trailing lambda here. And first of all, we will have a buttons block in which we define how our buttons look like. We then want to also have a title in which we define what our title is, so the title text composable. And we will have a description or content, how is it called? Text, which will be the description of our dialog. And last but not least, our modifier that we can directly pass from our parameters up here. Cool. So what will we start with? First of all, for the buttons, we want to have a column since we want to show, let me quickly launch my other app again to show you what I mean. We want to show, okay, I granted the permissions now, of course. Let's go to our app settings very quickly. Turn these back off. Don't allow for the camera permission. Go back, launch this again. And then if we click request one permission, we'll actually see the dialog again. If we click don't allow, then we'll actually see this dialog. So the button section will be this section down here. And I want to have this divider followed by this grant permission button, or the button that says whatever we want. And for that, we want to have a column which simply stacks this divider on top of our text. So this column will take a modifier of modifier fill max width. In here, we will have our divider, and then we have our text composable. The text will be dependent on if the permission is permanently declined. If it is, the button should say grant permission, and else it should simply say OK. So clicking on OK will then request the permission again. We then want to specify the font weight, set it to bold. We want to specify the alignment of the text, which will be center. We want to specify a modifier, which is modifier fill max width. Want to make sure that it's clickable. Here, what we trigger in this clickable block again depends on our boolean. So if it is permanently declined, we want to trigger our on go to app settings click lambda, and else we trigger our on OK click lambda. And finally, let's add some padding of 16 dp to our button, import dp, pressing Alt Enter. Let's get to our title next, which is simply a text composable, and the text will be permission required. So that can just be a generic title for all kind of permission dialogues, or you can configure that based on the permission as you like. Just the description here differs, so that will be a text. And here we will have a huge when block based on our permission. If that permission is manifest permission camera, we can now say what the text should be for the camera permission. And if we would do it like this, then this wouldn't be a really scalable approach and also violate a solid principle, since we then always need to change this permission dialog when we add a new permission to our app. A better approach would be to simply have a little interface called, for example, permission text provider, which will then simply have a val for, oh, it could be for the title, but we don't have different titles here. We could simply have a description, which is a string. And then instead of our actual permission that we pass here, we will pass the permission text provider. And then we can take this and replace this stuff with permission text provider, that description. And the advantage of this approach is that we are able to extend this permission text provider with with as many permissions as we like. And also if we wouldn't own this code here, this permission dialog code, so if it would come from a library, for example, we could still implement our own permission text providers to change the description of our text composable here, which would not be possible if we hardcode this in one expression here. So we could then have something like a class camera permission text provider, which is a permission text provider, add the description in here, and then let's actually make this dependent on whether we permanently decline it or not. So instead of this, we could say we have a function get description is permanently declined and returns a string. Actually, we don't want to implement that here. And then instead of this simple variable, we can say get description. And in here we return if is permanently declined, we say something like, it seems you permanently declined camera permission. You can go to the app settings to grant it. Something like this. And if it's not permanently declined, we say this app needs access to your camera in order, or actually so that your friends can see you in a call. Like this. We can then copy this and do this for our other permissions as well. In here, so we have a record audio permission text provider. So it seems you permanently declined microphone permission. This app needs access to your microphone so that your friends can hear you, can hear you in a call. And we have the same stuff for call. So phone call permission text provider. This will be, it seems you permanently declined phone calling permission. This app needs access to your, this app needs phone calling permission, for example, so that you can talk to your friends, something like this. And then dependent on what we want to, which permission we want to display in the dialog, we can then pass the corresponding provider here. We want to replace this with get description, which is then, which takes our Boolean, is permanently declined. And that is now a much cleaner approach that does not violate our solid principles. So we can now go back to our main activity below our column right here. And here we can now refer to our dialog queue and we can loop over it. So for each permission we get here from our queue, we now want to show our permission dialog. And it's actually dialog queue dot reversed. I'm just noticing, since it's a queue and the first dialog we want to see is the dialog that is last in our list. So we could simply fix this with reversed, or we need to adjust our view model that we directly reverse the list there. Let's just leave it here, format that a bit, and now, implement these parameters. The permission text provider is now dependent on our permission, and here's totally fine now to make this dependent on our permission string, since at some place we have to do it, but this is more scalable since here this is really code that we own, so we could definitely extend this code here. Let's specify manifest permission camera here. In that case, we want to camera permission text provider, duplicate that 2 more times, say that is for record audio. Let's do it like this. Record audio permission text provider. Let's keep it consistent to also have blocks for these. and this will be call phone. So phone call permission text provider, something like this. And in the else case, we simply want to return out of for each. So then we have a permission that we haven't implemented this yet. Cool. Let's format that. Is permanently declined. What will that be? So the thing is, Android actually does not give us a way to find out if a permission is really permanently declined. So the framework simply does not support that. There are no libraries that support that because it's just a framework limitation. A way that works, however, is if we say, if we shouldn't show a request permission rationale for a given permission, then in our case at least, we can be sure that it has been permanently declined. However, this is not reliable in all scenarios because this function will also return false if we haven't ever requested the permission at all. So sometimes you might want to actually, first of all, tell the user what a given permission is for, and when they then click OK on the dialog, then you want to request that permission. In this case, this kind of function would return false for the very first call as well, when you have never requested the permission before. And there's no way to actually distinguish between the very first call or if it was already permanently declined. So I really recommend this approach of first requesting the permission, that you know that when these dialogues show, the permission has at least been requested once in the past. And in that case, this is a reliable way to detect if the permission has been permanently declined. Usually you would also want to check if the permission is actually declined, but in this case this would be redundant since in our view model we already make sure that in our dialog queue there are only permissions that have been declined. In onDismiss, we want to call our view model onDismiss, dismiss dialog. On OK click, here we now want to first of all also dismiss the dialog, and then if the user clicks OK, we simply want to request the permission again. Because now that we told them what it's used for, the user might want to, the user might think, okay, now I actually know why I should grant that permission, and they will do it. So then we can now trigger our multiple, we haven't created that yet. We want to create a multiple permission launcher, of course. Let's copy this. Yeah, let's copy this. Paste it down below, call it multiple permission result launcher. Replace the contract with request multiple permissions. Here, the result will actually not be a Boolean since we get multiple permissions. Instead, it will be a map, as you can see, a map of strings. So the permission that maps to the corresponding Boolean. So whether that specific permission was granted or not. Then here the permission, we actually first of all want to loop through our permissions. So permissions.keys for each. So for every single permission we got a result for, we now want to call this function in our view model. First of all, actually not first of all, we just pass our permission, and is granted is perms at the with the key permission. And if that's equal to true, then we know that permission was granted. And now we'll take this multiple permissions result launcher and we will do something similar as here, just that we launch this down here. Now on OK click, we say launch, and this now takes an array of strings, so an array of permissions. We just want to request a single one since we hard-coded our first single launcher for camera permissions here. And we just want to make sure that it's a flexible approach, that it works for any type of permission. So we say array of permission. And then finally, if the user clicks on go to app settings, then we now, of course, want to send them to the app settings. How do we do that? I like to create an extension function for that down here. So we can say function activity dot open app settings, which will just be a normal function. And we do that simply by sending out an intent. We need to specify an action. The action is settings from android.provider dot action application details settings. And we want to specify a URI. The URI is our package name. So the package name of the application we want to show the details page for in the settings. And that will simply be our own package name, of course. So we say URI from parts. The scheme is package, since we refer to our package name. The actual package name is what we need to pass here. So we pass package name. and the fragment is nothing since we are not in a fragment. And then after we created that intent, we can say that also :start activity. So we just start an activity with the intent we just created. If we then scroll up, we can replace this with a call to open app settings, like this. And now only what's missing is if we scroll up to our second button that we also call our permission result launcher here. So here we want to say we have a multiple permission result launcher, call that launch, and in this case we want to request the call phone permission, and we want to request the record audio permission. And I would say I will uninstall my app and reinstall it so that we just have a fresh install with no permissions granted, and then we can try this out. So there we go, this is our app. If we now click request one permission, then the dialog will show we already tried this, but we haven't tried what happens if we decline here. So let's click don't allow. Then our dialog will show this app needs access to your camera so that your friends can see you in a call. So let's click OK. We should now see another permission request. Yes, we do. Let's click don't allow and see if we actually see the other dialog. Yep, now we permanently declined that camera permission. We can go to the app settings. Let's click grant permission. Then we get to our app settings, and here we see no permissions granted. And we could approve or grant the camera permission here. Let's do that. Go back, and we could also dismiss this dialog after we click this, by the way. Let's do this by clicking outside. If we now click this again, we shouldn't see any dialog, which does not happen. Very good. And finally, requesting multiple permissions. Let's don't allow recording audio and allow phone calling. Let's actually don't allow both. So we see that the queue is working, hopefully at least. Don't allow these. And then we will see, okay, it actually needs access to your microphone. So let's click OK. Then we get our microphone permission again. Let's click, we now approve this. And this should actually not happen. It seems like it's not dismissing the dialog after we approve this. I will take a look into that after this. But let's first of all check if it's also showing the dialog for phone calling next. So let's click outside, and no, it does not show that. Maybe I didn't adjust the text. Could that be? If we scroll down, no, I did. Okay, that is something I will need to check, and then I will get back to you once I fixed it. All right, welcome back. There are actually two little fixes we need to make here. On the one hand, well, that's not really a fix, but I want to do that to have the proper logic here in our view model for our queue, that we swap these remove last with remove first. And instead of adding at the first index, we add at the last index. And the reason why we do this is if we consider our queue, then let's say we first of all request record audio permission and then call phone permission. Then after we request record audio permission, this is how our queue will look like. And that is also the dialog that should show up at first. And if we then request call phone permission next, it will look like this. But if we then see the dialog record audio first and we then dismiss it, we want to remove the first entry of our queue, which is why we have remove first here. And we add it at the last index because, yeah, this new call phone permission should, of course, then come after our record audio permission when it is about showing dialogs. However, we still want to keep the reversed here, since if we consider how dialogs are shown in Compose, they are all shown at once. So if in our dialog queue, the first entry is record audio permission and we want to show the record audio dialog first, then we will show it. Then it will go through the next entry, which will be a call phone. Then the call phone permission dialog will be shown on top of our first record audio permission dialog, which is of course not what we want. And that is why we reverse it, so that the dialog that should show up at first is actually the last one in our list. Now, of course, we could already implement it like that in our view model, but I like this approach more, since this is a very individual thing for how dialogs work. The logical order is still what we have in our view model, and that is why I kind of like to have the reversed function here. Then the next thing we need to do is that if we consider maps in Kotlin, like here, this perms is a map that maps permissions to a boolean. These maps, or the keys of these, actually don't have a real order since it's not a list. So in this case, since these are strings, they will be ordered alphabetically. So we will go through these alphabetically, but not in the order we really request these permissions. To fix that, we need to define these permissions we want to request, at least for the multiple permission launcher. permissions to request. And that is an array of, let's just paste this from below here, these two, and swap this out with our permissions to request. Scroll up, paste these in here, and this way we make sure that the record audio dialog will actually also show before our call phone dialog. We can then simply swap this out with permissions to request. And one last little fix we need to make is in our view model. In onPermissions result, we actually also want to check if that permission is not in our queue yet. So if visual permissions dialog queue does not contain our permission, then we want to add it, because there are certain scenarios where it could happen that the permission gets added multiple times to our queue. We don't want that. The reason for that is that these launchers are actually always called. So even if we don't see a permission request, so we still get results here, and under certain scenarios, we could then see the permanently declined dialog, even though that wasn't the case. So I would say we try this one more time and hope for the best. Let's launch this here. Take a look on the emulator. Let's first of all try request one permission. Let's say don't allow, and then we do see our permission required dialog. Clicking OK. That will request the permission again. Let's click don't allow again. Then we should see the permanently declined dialog, which we do see. And let's dismiss this for now. And you will probably also notice something interesting. Yes, we do get the phone calling permission dialog here. Why is that? That's actually quite an edge case here that is only happening because of how we did this in this video. Usually in a real life scenario, this wouldn't happen. So let me explain. The reason this happens is that this onResult callback of our multiple permission launcher is also called when we get the result from our single permission result launcher. So this is really a rare scenario here, and in the real world that would not happen, since on one screen you would either have a single launcher or a launcher to request multiple permissions. This is only happening because I want to show you both ways so you're flexible in your app. But let's also try the multiple permissions, which is interesting, more interesting. Let's not allow both of these. Don't allow and don't allow. Now we should see the microphone permission dialog first. Yes, this app needs access to your microphone. Let's click OK. Let's click don't allow, for example. And then we get the phone calling permission. Let's click OK. Now we could, for example, click allow to allow that. And now we get the permanently declined permission for our microphone again. And we could grant that. If we dismiss the dialog, then nothing will show again. If we click request multiple permissions again, it will show the permanently declined dialog for those we actually permanently declined. So for our microphone, we could then grant this here in our app settings. So I think this is really complex actually. If you want to implement such a permission handling system with all these different rationales and stuff like that, this is one of the things that I think is way too hard, or way harder than it needs to be. I think Google could actually hide a lot of this logic that we defined here in the Android framework, or rather at least provide an option that lets us define what should happen in these cases. So if the permission was declined once, and what happens if it was declined multiple times. And if you really want that fine-grained control, you can still do this. But I think in most cases, you really just want to show these dialogues and tell the user what went wrong. Nevertheless, I still hope you now know how to actually use permissions in your app properly, and also how to handle multiple permissions and multiple permission requests. If you like this video, then you will definitely also love my advanced Android premium courses, which you can all find using the first link in this video's description. So these really teach you advanced Android concepts, architecture, multiple modules, and basically just what you need to become an industry-ready Android developer. So do check these out. And apart from that, I wish you an amazing rest of your week, and I'll see you back in the next video. Bye bye.